deafening crash of the cauldron lid, the roar of boiling water, and a desperate, piercing scream that seemed to pierce the stone walls. Thus began the final page of Henry's reign. Those who were closest to him later said that the smell was unbearable from the very first moments, and the king's skin began to blister as soon as his body touched the boiling water. On the platform, under a canopy, in the shadow of crosses and banners, stood his wife, forced to watch him choke on his own moans, unable to turn away. These events did not happen suddenly. For months before the execution, the royal court had been living in a state of prolonged fear. Henry, who until recently had been confident of his right to the throne, found himself at the center of a conspiracy involving the interests of the nobility, the clergy, and neighboring powers. The illness that was sapping his strength began imperceptibly, with steady weakness, swelling in his legs, and a fever that would subside and then return with renewed vigor. The court physicians, men of the old school, tried to treat him with bloodletting and rubbing him with hot ointments made from lard and crushed herbs, but each session left him paler and weaker. Servants whispered about nighttime cries coming from the royal chambers. The cupbearers claimed that strange sediments were found in Henry's drinking cups, and once, during evening mass, he suddenly went blind in one eye and could barely stand. The secret guard's reports for that month mentioned several times that people not on the list of courtiers had entered the chambers. It was said that the bishops were arguing among themselves whether the king's illness was a punishment from heaven or the result of human malice. The archives contain several entries by the personal physician dated late spring. They mention ulcers on the thighs and abdomen that didn't heal but only spread, oozing pus and a pungent odor. The flesh around the sores darkened, and the doctors, fearing rotten fever, cauterized them with red-hot iron. These procedures were performed to the singing of psalms, but Henry's cries drowned out any prayers. His fingers trembled even when he was at rest, and his speech became increasingly incoherent. With each passing day, he lost control not only over the country, but also over himself. His advisors increasingly held meetings without him, and decisions that had been made in his presence the day before were now approved with the seal of the heir. Servants avoided spending long periods of time in his chambers because of the stench and the tense, almost insane look in the king's eyes. A scribe from among the monks, who had been allowed to see him only twice during this period, described his face as the face of a man who sees not us, but what awaits him beyond the grave. The political situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The Catholic Party and supporters of reform made no secret of their mutual hatred. Within the palace, a quiet struggle was underway to see who would be closest to the monarch at the moment of his death, as this would mean control over the seals, decrees, and inheritance. Reports from the captain of the palace guard mentioned that Henry's doors were locked with 2 bolts at night, and that only 3 trusted people had access to him, and 2 of them, according to rumors, were already in league with the king's enemies. Everything changed when, at a meeting of the Privy Council in early summer, it was decided to depose Henry on the pretext of inability to rule. His illness was officially declared a sign of God's wrath, and accusations of treason and secret alliance with enemies of the state were grounds for execution. The sentence was unprecedented. It was decided to execute him, according to the example of the ancients, disgracing not only his body, but also his memory. Henry's wife, who at first tried to obtain a lenient sentence for him, was ordered to attend the execution. Refusal would have meant an accusation of complicity. Priests sent to the king the day before recorded in their notes that he could barely speak, but his eyes burned with rage. He refused to confess, saying that his sins were fewer than those of those standing at the gate. On the evening before his execution, he was taken from his chambers. The servants carrying the stretcher said that they could feel the heat under the sheets, as if from red-hot metal. They walked slowly as the king's body was covered with wet bandages, and every jolt caused quiet, muffled moans. In the courtyard, a cauldron filled with water stood ready, into which handfuls of salt and herbs were thrown, supposedly for purification. By morning, the square around the palace was filled with people. They had come not only from the city, but also from the surrounding villages. It was said that the execution was to be a sign, and many waited for a miracle, but no miracle happened. Instead, what chroniclers would later call a day of paralyzed silence began. He was led to the platform, supported by his elbows. His legs could barely hold him up. His knees were shaking, and each step was accompanied by a hoarse groan. Henry's face was ashen gray, with spots of inflammation on his cheekbones. His lips were cracked, and his tongue barely moved in his mouth. The crowd fell silent when they saw that it was not a ruler standing before them, but a broken, sick man who had only enough strength left to breathe. Kazan stood in the center of the platform, surrounded by oak supports. A fire was already roaring beneath him, and thick steam rose from the water, smelling of salt and herbs. This smell mixed with the smell of burning and wet wood, and it all seemed unbearably heavy in the morning air. The king's wife, dressed in black with her head covered, stood a few steps away. Two guards held her by the elbows to keep her from looking away. Servants in dark canvas shirts removed Henry's outer garments, leaving him in only a long shirt, wet with sweat and soaked with ointment. Dark strips of bandages were visible under the fabric on his stomach and thighs, some of them already soaked through. The skin on his shins was covered with sores that gave off a pungent smell of rot. Several people in the crowd turned away. Some crossed themselves. The captain of the guard read out the sentence. His voice was steady, unhurried, as if he were reading a routine decree. The words treason and conspiracy with the enemy were drowned out by the roar of the crowd, but the phrase "to be boiled alive" rang out clearly. Henry tried to say something, but only a croak escaped his throat, and he lowered his head. He was led to a wooden ladder, leading to the edge of the cauldron. The soldiers lifted him up by his arms, and one of the executioners, wrapped in a leather apron, grabbed the ropes from which a thick wooden circle with handles was suspended, a device for lowering the body into the boiling water. When his feet touched the surface, the first muffled cry rang out. The water boiled, and blisters instantly formed on his skin. Henry tried to raise his knees, but the executioner's hands pushed him deeper. The noise of the fire and boiling water drowned out everything except the screams, which grew louder and more desperate. The crowd froze, only the occasional cries of "Lord, have mercy" breaking the silence. His wife stood motionless, her fingers clenching the fabric of her sleeve so tightly that her knuckles turned white. No tears flowed. Her eyes were wide open, like someone who had stopped blinking out of sheer terror. According to eyewitness accounts, at some point, Henry stopped screaming, and only ragged breaths rose from his chest. The foam on the surface of the water turned pink. The executioners held him in boiling water until the order was given. When he was lifted out, the skin on his legs and stomach was peeling off, and his body resembled a piece of burnt fabric, still steaming. His breathing was barely audible. The guards carried him to a wooden stretcher and covered him with a coarse cloth. According to reports from the palace archives, he lived for several more hours in a semi-conscious state. At that time, his seals were already being divided up in the palace, and new appointments were being discussed. A priest was allowed to see his wife, but she refused to confess, saying that all the words that needed to be said had already been said. By evening, news of the execution had spread throughout the city. Some saw it as retribution, others as blasphemy. Scribes recorded that a crowd was singing psalms at the palace gates, while in the alleys there was already talk of who would take the throne and how long the new ruler would last. As the sun set, Henry's body still lay in a side hole of the palace, where it had been moved from the dungeon to hide it from the crowd. The room was cramped, with a low ceiling and a narrow window through which the evening chill blew. But the coolness could not overcome the heavy smell. The ointment that had been hastily applied to the burns mixed with the smell of steaming flesh and festering wounds. The guards standing watch at his bedside tried not to look at him directly. Henry was semi-conscious, his eyes wandering, his lips moving silently. Sometimes he began to moan, and then one of the doctors, a monk with crimson hands, poured a thick poppy seed broth into his mouth to dull the pain. The broth caused him to mumble incoherently, uttering only a few names and fragments of phrases. Archival records of one of the court physicians, found decades later, describe his condition dryly and ruthlessly. The skin on the lower half of his body was peeling away from the flesh in layers. Blisters were bursting, releasing a dark-colored liquid with a pungent odor. His pulse was barely palpable. His breathing was shallow, with rare deep sighs, followed by long pauses. In the corridors of the palace, bargaining for the future was already underway. The heir, supported by part of the old nobility, demanded the immediate transfer of power into his hands, claiming that Henry was effectively dead. His opponents insisted on waiting for his last breath, not out of respect, but in order to have time to seize the seals and rewrite the decrees. The captain of the palace guard ordered the guard to be doubled in the side hall, and not to let anyone in except the doctors and his wife. His wife, however, did not enter his chamber. After the morning execution, she locked herself in her rooms, and, according to the maids, sat motionless before an icon, touching neither food nor water. Only once did a priest manage to get to her, but the conversation was brief. Rumors that she had cursed the advisors who forced her to attend the execution quickly spread throughout the palace. By midnight, Henry's breathing had become quieter. His lips were cracked, and his eyes were dry and cloudy. He no longer recognized those around him. One of the doctors, a young student at the monastery school, wrote in his diary, "I saw him swallow with difficulty, as if every drop of air cut his throat. His fingers clenched into a fist, the skin on them turned yellow, and his nails turned black. The last moments came suddenly. He took a deep, ragged breath, and his chest stopped moving. The doctors looked at each other. One approached, leaned over his face, paused for a moment, and straightened up. He's gone." The guards crossed themselves, but their faces remained stony. Death had not resolved the issues. It had only exacerbated them. The body had to be removed secretly to avoid unrest. A deserted corridor leading to a service exit was chosen for this purpose. 4 servants lifted the stretcher, but the smell became unbearable with the first few steps. Even the hastily tied rags over his face did not help. The burns he had received in boiling water decomposed rapidly, and the cloth wrapped around his thighs and stomach became saturated with pus. In the basement of the palace, where he was taken, preparations for embalming began. According to the rules of the time, the body of the sovereign had to be preserved for display for several days. But the doctors immediately realized that the task was almost impossible. The skin on the lower part of the body was already coming off, and the internal tissues had begun to decompose. The usual remedies, wax, fragrant oils, crushed myrtle, could not overcome the smell. When the chest was opened, it was discovered that the lungs had partially disintegrated, and a foul-smelling liquid had accumulated in the abdomen. It was decided to resort to extreme measures, to pour strong wine and resin into the cavity, and then sew it up with coarse thread. The face was covered with a thick cloth soaked in vinegar. Clothes for burial were placed over rolled-up layers of linen rags to hide the unevenness. Meanwhile, meetings were already underway in the halls upstairs. Rumors of his agonizing death spread throughout the city. For some, he was a tyrant, and his execution was considered God's punishment. For others, he was the legitimate king, fallen victim to a conspiracy. Preachers appeared in the streets, shouting that those who boiled him alive would themselves be boiled in hell. Foreign ambassadors in the capital hastily sent messengers with reports. The ambassador of the northern kingdom wrote, "The palace is gripped by a cold fever. Those who yesterday wore Henry's coat of arms are today removing it from their shoulders. His death will not bring peace, it will bring a storm." By morning, the body was ready to be carried out. A quiet hour was chosen when the streets were empty. Accompanied by guards and monks, the coffin was carried out through the back gate. No bells rang. The king's death had not yet been officially announced. He was laid in the chapel of the monastery, where he was to await the orders of the new ruler. But the delay in the official announcement only added to the chaos. Self-proclaimed envoys of the council began to appear in various parts of the capital, announcing their own versions of events. Some said that the king had been killed by his enemies, others that he had died of illness, and still others that he was alive and in hiding. This fueled fears and pushed people toward unrest. The night, when the city still did not know that its ruler lay in a monastery chapel, turned out to be longer than usual. The guards at the palace gates changed more often than usual. Cloaks rustled in the corridors, and you could hear people walking between the doors, trying not to let their heels click. At dawn, when a thin layer of fog settled on the empty square, the advisors gathered in a cramped room with no windows. They spoke quietly, as if afraid that the walls would echo their words. They decided to announce the death at noon and schedule a prayer service for the evening. This was required by form, but not everyone was ready to obey form. One part of the nobility insisted that the name of the new ruler be announced immediately, without delay. The other demanded a delay, at least one day, to legally formalize the transfer of seals, confirm the distribution of offices, and record the promises made to those who had helped during these troubled weeks. The townspeople learned the truth before noon. A servant from the monastery sent for candles and rags, let it slip to a market woman on the corner, and within hours, the markets were abuzz with speculation about where and how the body lay. At noon, the chapel gates had to be closed to keep out the crowds of people who wanted to see the dead man. The priests set up censers with thick smoke of resin and myrrh, but the smell did little to mask another, heavier and more distinct odor. The guard noted in his notebook that by midday, at least 3 women had fainted at the chapel doors, and 2 men had come out, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs, pale as chalk. The body was prepared as best they could. The face was covered with a thick cloth soaked in vinegar. The chest cavity was filled with wine-soaked tow. The abdomen was filled with linen rolls soaked in resin. The arms were folded across the abdomen and secured with thin straps under the sleeves of the clothing so that they would not move. The legs were wrapped in long strips of cloth, over which thickly embroidered stockings were put on. A wide collar was placed around the neck to hide the dark spots. It did not smell of incense, but of a hospital cellar, as musty as a damp basement without windows. The young monk assigned to watch over the candles wrote in his journal that evening. He wiped the sweat from his face, more often than he adjusted the wicks, and each time he entered, he held his breath as if before diving. His wife was brought to the chapel at sunset. She walked slowly, without raising her eyes. Her face was colorless, her hands hidden in wide sleeves. The priest quietly offered a prayer, but she did not respond. She stared at the frozen face through the damp fabric for a few moments, and asked just as quietly, "When will they give him to the earth?" The priest took a step back and said that the funeral would be scheduled after the official farewell. She did not cry. She only said, "Let it all end quickly." Leaving the chapel, she did not return to the palace. She was taken to a house where widowed relatives of the nobility had previously lived, so that the crowd and strangers would not guess her condition. Meanwhile, the council argued about the order of the farewell. Some insisted on a public procession to show the townspeople the power of the authorities, while others categorically objected The body would not withstand the long journey and the spectacle in the open air. The doctors confirmed the latter. The eldest of them spoke calmly, looking at the floor. The heat from the cauldron had accelerated the decomposition to such an extent that any delay would be disastrous, and in just one day, everything could get out of control. He suggested placing the body in the palace's great hall for just one evening, with the windows closed, surrounded by candles and incense, allowing people to enter in small groups, and keeping monks with vinegar nearby. This plan was accepted. In the evening, heavy fabrics were hung in the hall to conceal the walls, and new candle holders were set up. The floor was covered with fresh reed mats to absorb anything that might seep out of the coffin if the threads failed. At the entrance, a table was set up with bowls containing sponges soaked in vinegar and silk handkerchiefs for noble ladies. The palace guards had rehearsed the order of movement in advance. People entered from one side, approached, bowed, stepped back, and exited through another door so as not to create a crowd. Singers were sent from the monastery and instructed to sing softly and evenly without straining their voices. A court chronicler described that evening in a few short lines, as if he wanted to get rid of the memory. He noted that the candles were smoking, and the smoke hung in the still air, that the people, usually lively at court, spoke in whispers, that the children of the nobility peered out from behind the backs of adults, not daring to come closer. He mentioned his wife, who did not come, and how a short phrase passed between whispering lips. They made her watch. That's enough. There's also a line about how one of the young courtiers, recently promoted, stood too close to the coffin, trying to see something, and then rubbed his hands in vinegar for a long time, although there were no marks or bruises on his skin. By midnight, the guards noticed that the candles had to be changed more often. The heat in the hall was rising, the windows remained closed, and the movement of people did not stop. The smell grew thicker. The doctors quietly ordered the crowd to move faster. The monks sang without stopping. A short time later, only the nobles were allowed inside, and a prayer service was announced at the doors for the townspeople to keep those who did not understand why it was taking so long from entering. This worked only partially. People argued irritably at the gates, and the captain of the guard ordered some of the sentries to be removed from the palace corridors and posted in the square, while the hall hummed with low singing in the neighboring rooms. The reason for the delay in announcing the heir was taking place. Scribes rewrote documents, inserting the names of those who had been promised positions. The elders from the inner circle asked for lines to be added about estates that had been granted, while the younger ones asked for grain and iron supplies. There was talk of how to control the most dangerous parts of the capital's streets, and how the garrisons in the provinces would react. One of the ambassadors quietly demanded that the future ruler confirm all previous treaties, and hinted that without this, new troops would appear on the border. He was promised words and a seal, but the seal was still in the box of a man who had kept it with him until the last hour, and did not want to give it up until he received a specific position and money. Towards morning, the body was returned to the chapel. The hall was aired, the reeds from the floor were burned in the courtyard, and the censers were carried out, as empty chests are carried out after a move. The doctors examined the stitches and bandages, and tightened the threads where they had begun to weaken. One of the young apprentices quietly asked if it would be better to hasten the burial. The elder replied that it was not up to them, but to those who counted the days and hours by the tolling of the bells. He understood that it was pointless to argue with the council. His dry note was preserved in the papers from that morning. If the burial could not take place today, other measures would have to be taken tomorrow. His wife was brought to the monastery again, this time in broad daylight. She walked past the guards, her steps slow and steady. She stood inside the chapel for a while, then asked the priest to leave her alone. He hesitated, but left. She came out a short time later without saying a word. Her knees buckled on the stairs, and a servant managed to catch her by the arm. Later, A maid would say that her mistress had ordered her to cut the black ribbon from her hair and not tie it again until the earth fell on the coffin lid. At noon, the official announcement was made. A herald stepped out onto the square in front of the palace. Priests stood beside him, and an advisor read a short text. The sovereign had died, the heir was taking power, and a day of prayer would be appointed. The crowd listened without interruption, but in the depths of the square, someone shouted about the cauldron and those who had given the order. The captain of the guard gave a signal, and people in cloaks immediately moved toward the shout. No further cries followed. The procession to the burial site was short. It was decided not to carry the coffin through the entire city, but to walk in a monastic procession to the old necropolis. Monks with censers walked on both sides. Priests read the prescribed prayers. The guards kept their ranks tighter than usual. There were few people. At a narrow turn, the pallbearers stumbled on a pothole. The coffin tilted, the lid creaked, and one of the nails flew out. A doctor, walking nearby, immediately pressed the board with his palm, and the pallbearers straightened their load. The smell grew stronger at that moment, and the people at the back of the procession moved apart, some stepping back and covering their mouths with handkerchiefs. Those in front walked faster than was proper. The burial was conducted according to custom, without unnecessary words. The earth was thrown neatly with a shovel so as not to raise unnecessary dust. The wife was led to the edge, threw a small stone into the grave, as local custom required, and stepped back. The priest said a short prayer. No one cried aloud. Immediately after the end, the guards turned back at a quick pace, as if they had other business to attend to, and only a few monks remained in the cemetery to finish what was required. One of them wrote, "After everyone had left, he stood for a short time by the fresh mound and listened to the wind blowing and the fine sand crunching under his shoes. The death of the sovereign didn't bring order. Within a few days, troops from the provinces moved toward the city, each with their own oaths and expectations. Rooms were opened in the capital where people gathered with different signs on their cloaks, and each of them recalled what the man who now lay in the ground had promised them under the previous regime. Sacks of grain began to disappear from the market. The owners kept their supplies, guessing the price of the coming autumn. Leaflets with speeches by preachers were distributed in the streets, saying that a painful death was a sign for all who would stray from the straight path. In monasteries, people whispered about how the new ruler would resolve the dispute between the old and new teachings. Ambassadors sent new letters. Some demanded guarantees, others promised help, and still others waited silently to see who would be the first to slip up. Genya was assigned a house on the outskirts of the city, and guards stood at the gate day and night. She was sometimes seen in the monastery garden, where she sat motionless, staring at the water in the pond. Servants said that at night she woke up from the sharp smell of ointments, although there were no medicines in the house, and wiped her face with a handkerchief, as if trying to wipe away something that was no longer there. She was rarely taken out to see people. At receptions, she remained silent. People spoke to her quietly and briefly, without asking questions. The carpets and patterns on the walls of the palace rooms were changed, but the people remained the same. Some changed their cloaks and rings. Some changed the words they spoke. The young were promoted. The old were pushed aside, but not completely. The dispute over the seals ended on the day the new sovereign sat down in the chair and took the oath from the senior advisor. Since then, the seals have been kept in a different box. On the same day, it was announced that the execution was lawful and just, and that the new government would not allow any unrest or strife. The townspeople listened and remained silent. Most of the silence was not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. They had seen the execution hall, the thick smoke, and the pallbearers who had nearly dropped the coffin. A little later, one of the senior physicians wrote a short treatise in which, without naming names, he described the burns and rapid decomposition of the seriously ill ruler. He wrote dryly, In a person with ulcers and soft tissue decay, hot water causes sudden disintegration of the outer and inner layers, severe intoxication, and death, even if breathing is maintained for a short time. He added that the smell was an accurate sign of impending doom, which could not be stopped by herbs, wine, or resin. This work was passed around and read by everyone who had to deal with the sick. Some made notes in the margins about prayers, others about how much fabric was needed for bandages, if it was necessary to hide what could not be shown. Secret notes by the captain of the guard, discovered after his death, speak more directly. He writes that the execution order was signed by 3 people, and that 2 of them demanded new estates for themselves that same evening. He writes that the city cannot be held with words, but with bread and steel. He writes that the woman who was forced to watch did not utter a single curse, but her silence is heavier than loud words. That there is no poetry in these words, only the steady line of ordinary service, in which people remove what stands in the way and put new locks on the doors. In the weeks that followed, the signs on the banners in the capital changed. Other preachers began to speak in the squares. Cases came to court against those who yesterday whispered with joy at the execution, and today found themselves in a place where they were led away without a sound. Horse patrols from neighboring villages passed along the border, checking the strength of the new orders. In the markets, sellers got used to the new order. Part of their income went where it had gone before, and part went into new pockets. In the homes of the nobility, some portraits were taken down and others hung up. The profile on the coins changed. All this happened without a sound, like changing strips of fabric on a long table. One is pulled off, another is laid on top and secured. The city did not forget the cauldron. Children asked each other if it was true that water boiled longer if you threw salt into it. Women intertwined conversations about birth and death. Men at feasts drank to everyone having a chance to get closer to the press, and to never regretting it. Monks prayed for humility, but even they sometimes argued about who was right, those who cooked or those who watched. There was no answer. There was only a steady, long-lasting memory of how wisps of smoke drifted above the damp candles, and how the roar of the crowd outside drowned in the hollow air of the hall. Thus ended a series of weeks and months in which illness, fear, and calculation marched side by side and gave way to one another. The body went into the ground, but the spirit of power, which had been fought over during his lifetime, remained above, in the hands of those who did not stand at the cauldron, but at the table with the papers. This brought no peace. It meant only one thing. The new order would be as harsh as the old, and there would always be a place in it for those who read short sentences, sign with a steady hand, and remain silent where others shout.